Do you consider yourself to be imaginative? You know, Albert Einstein said that logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will get you anywhere. He believed that imagination was everything, that it was a preview of the attractions of life to come. I think that as we get older, it's very easy to stop dreaming, to stop using our imagination. You know, we're so caught up, aren't we, with the day-to-day, making a living, making a home, making a family, making a career. We stop dreaming. We might have goals. We're very good at setting goals, aren't we? But do we have personal dreams? I think a lot of us, when we get to 50, 60, have kind of stopped dreaming. Some of us even think that there's nothing left to dream for. And so we don't exercise our imagination. I think we use our imaginations for the negative things. We imagine everything going wrong. We imagine life not being as we want it to be, and we use it to fuel our worry and our anxiety. I think that imagination can save your life. I want to tell you a little story about my grandfather and how I believe imagination got him through World War II. So I'm going to take you back to 1942, 80 years ago, more than 80 years, my goodness, and the fall of Singapore. My grandfather was a military policeman in the British forces, and he was one of the last soldiers to be evacuated from Singapore as the Japanese came in. He was on a motor launch with some of the top brass. It's not clear why he and his 3 fellow military policemen were there. The top brass would have had their own security detail, but that's a story for another time. For this time, I want you to imagine they're leaving the dock and they're looking back at Singapore, and Singapore is ablaze. The warehouses, which were wooden, which they called the go-downs, were all alight, so the whole sky was lit up as if on fire. The Japanese were bombing any ships that were trying to leave and any small boats that were trying to leave. So they travelled by night and they holed up during the day and put camouflage nets over their motor launch. Their job was to get these senior officers to safety, and so they set off, and lots of tales of daring do. But to cut a long story short, they were constantly under fire from the Japanese planes overhead until eventually the inevitable happened and their motor launch was hit and began to sink. So under fire, they were all told to jump into the water, shark-infested waters, I hasten to add, and swim for the nearby shore. So they all swam to the shore. The Japanese boat that was on the horizon turned and came to see what was going on, and they destroyed what was left of their boat and all their radio equipment. But they left the men on the island. Now, this island had been abandoned by the local people when they saw what was happening. There had been a Dutch listening station on the top of the hill, but the Dutch soldiers, thinking that the Japanese were going to come and invade the island, destroyed all their equipment. So there was no way of contacting the outside world. So as I say, the Japanese left them there and sailed away because they had more pressing things to do. This island was infested with mosquitoes. They all fell ill. They had malaria, yellow fever, beriberi, all kinds of unpleasant illnesses. And they began to die one by one. The situation got so bad that several of the men took their own lives. They lost hope completely and could not see a future. If they were suffering from malaria, of course, they wouldn't have been in their right minds. My grandfather survived. I came across a book several years ago, written by one of the officers that was marooned with him on that island. The officer talks about how he and my grandfather would talk about hunting rabbits in the fields near where they lived. They talked about the sea, they talked about the countryside, they talked about home. And the officer felt that he'd found someone he could exercise his imagination with. Eventually, after 4 months, the Japanese came back to the island and picked up the men. They took them back to Singapore and they went into Changi prison and to various other prison camps. And that was where my grandfather spent the rest of the war. Like most men, he never talked about his war experiences. They were told explicitly not to. The psychology of the time was that they'd gone through enough and they shouldn't talk about it. Their families didn't need to know these horrific details of their imprisonment. And he died when I was 14, so as an adult, I wasn't able to talk to him about it. But I've often wondered, why did he survive? He was 5 stone when he came home. 5 stone. He wasn't a big man anyway. He was a bantamweight boxer. But 5 stone. He died young, probably as a result of his heart being weakened by the deprivations of being a prisoner of war. But he survived, and I remember him as someone who told stories, who had an imagination. What if that was the difference between the men who survived and the men who didn't, illness aside? So why am I telling you this story? Well, you see, if we have the ability to take ourselves out of ourselves, to take ourselves somewhere else when we're in extremis, if we're ill, if we're depressed, if we're in a situation that we can't see an end to, does that give us a greater chance of survival? We know that imagination is used by top sportsmen. They imagine themselves running the fastest, going over the line first, being the strongest. They go through and imagine their matches play by play. They imagine themselves as winners. Muhammad Ali said, "A man without imagination is a man without wings." I think that it's really important that we reclaim our ability to dream as we get older. I read a wonderful autobiography by Diane Athill, who said that when she finally went into a nursing home in her 90s, she would sit and look at some of the other ladies there sitting in their chairs and wonder if they too were reliving all their romantic encounters. I love that thought. You can take yourself out of anywhere, even out of the deprivations of a prisoner of war camp. Nelson Mandela spoke at length about how he survived being on Robben Island for so many years. Imagination is everything. Walt Disney said, if you can dream it, you can do it. Well, maybe that would be me being a bit Pollyanna. If you have a chronic illness, or you're in a situation that isn't going to change in the near future, it might be a little bit confronting for me to say, imagine your way out of it. That's not really what I'm saying. What I am saying is use your imagination for better times, to create a preview of life's attractions ahead, as Einstein put it. That's my thought for the day, anyway. Here's to dreaming. Here's to exercising our imaginations in more ways than worrying. Until next time.